Hello, you're listening to Hear This Idea, a podcast showcasing new thinking in philosophy, the social sciences, and effective altruism. Okay, in this episode we talked to Thomas Moynihan. He's a writer and historian interested in the history of ideas surrounding existential risk. His most recent book is called X Risk, and the subtitle is How Humanity Discovered Its Own Extinction. So the book basically tells a story of how people gradually discovered the perils and promises that face humanity as a species. What does that mean? Well, nowadays there's this kind of growing recognition that humanity's potential is enormous in scale, but it's also fragile. There are no laws of nature or outside forces which are, looking out for us here, and there is just any number of ways in which things might get irrecoverably lost. Now, we've talked in previous episodes about what some of those X risks look like and how we might prevent them. But this conversation is more meta. It's not about specific risks, but rather how people came to appreciate that there is such a class of risks in the first place. Now, you might wonder whether this interest in existential risk is really so novel or so important, right? So on one hand, you might think it's a kind of intellectual fad. It's a bit sci-fi, it's a bit overhyped. And on the other hand, you might reasonably say, well, people have been thinking about the end of the world for absolutely ages. So this new wave of interest is just a case of, window dressing some old ideas in sciencey, secular language. But as Tom explains, both these worries miss the point. You'll hopefully get a better sense in the interview, but you might think that there are kind of two parts to his thesis. On the one hand, he shows that this preoccupation with human extinction does have really deep roots in the history of ideas, and its emergence is tied up in all sorts of interesting ways with the story of geology, demography, the discovery of evolution by natural selection, and even Enlightenment philosophy in general. But on the other hand, there's a really important sense in which today's ideas about human extinction are very unlike religious ideas of apocalypse, for instance. And in that sense, it's crazy to appreciate just how modern this realization really is. I mean, the realization that there is no, guiding hand stopping us from messing up and just putting an end to the whole human story. This is definitely something I hadn't considered before, but it turns out that for centuries, this idea of human extinction just barely registered on anyone's minds, at least anyone who was writing anything. But also, it was a really hard discovery to make in some ways, because old ways of thinking just didn't allow for the really important distinctions which we take for granted nowadays. Distinctions between the possible and the actual, the organic and the inorganic, and between ethics and physics, for instance, if that makes sense. So Tom's thought is that recognizing that we are capable of going extinct and that we have some control over whether that happens, that is a kind of hallmark of modernity. It's like a sign of maturity. And in our conversation, we get to meet some figures from this history and discuss the significance of intellectual history more generally. It's an absolute monster lengthwise, so as always, you're encouraged to use the chapter markers we've included, and you can skip to questions which sound most interesting that way. But without further ado, here's the episode.
My name's Thomas Moynihan. I currently am... So I've got a grant from the Berkeley Existential Risk Initiative, and I'm currently collaborating with the Future of Humanity Institute. Mainly, I'm working with Anders Sandberg, so we're doing a few papers together, and I'm helping him a bit with the beginning of his forthcoming book, entitled Grand Futures, where he's looking at the history of thinking about the long-term prospects for humanity. And so that's where I come in, because I'm an intellectual historian, even though that sounds like I'm calling myself a historian who is more intellectual than others. Historian of ideas might be a better way of putting it. And my research up until now has been mainly focusing on the history behind what we now call existential risk. So the history of the idea of human extinction. But obviously, as I'm sure we're going to talk about, that brings in all kinds of other things like the history of our thinking about the future and the prospects for humanity.
Yeah, this phrase "intellectual history" is kind of new to me. Can you say something about what that is, and also how does someone end up doing intellectual history? What was your route to it?
Yeah. So it's a strange one. I mean, you will find intellectual history departments in universities, but not so often. I guess the very basic way would be kind of material history, so studying wars and kind of the history of economics and things like that. So intellectual history is rarer because you're studying how ideas develop over time. So, obviously those two things are blurred in practice. But yeah, I mean, it's quite an old field, so you could trace it back to probably to the Enlightenment, actually. But people have only started kind of really talking about the history of ideas with those terms since the early 1900s. But yeah, how does one find themselves? So yeah, I had a rather strange path to it. So I've always been interested in history. I guess what you'd actually call big history. So some of my earliest obsessions as a kid were paleontology and extinctions. I actually came up through English departments through university. But I always felt kind of alien and didn't really fit. So I just decided that I would cultivate what I find interesting. And that, happened to be that I was very interested in, history of science, history of philosophy. But yeah, and I guess in a way that, is perhaps even slightly unique from those fields, is coming up through kind of English departments, through very humanities background. When I was an undergrad, deconstruction, Derrida, those were the kind of things that we were taught were, the cutting edge. And so the kind of general tenor was one of what I now call suspicion. So it's this general mood of a kind of very immodest totalization of modesty as a kind of epistemic principle. So you try and humble any claim to authority, any claim to standards, or even reason itself. This always kind of struck me as wrong. So at some point during undergrad, I went and was like, I'm going to go and read through these people that, are so railed against in the humanities. So the kind of the grand figures of the Enlightenment. So I, went back and read Kant and, his ilk. And that led me to this just fundamental thing that I became absolutely obsessed with is, what I see as kind of one of the grand dramas of, I guess, modernity itself is, I guess, a conflict between disillusion and dignity. So, this sense that we, with modernity, we realize that in a sense we self-legislate our own values, which of course gives us a lot of freedom or a sense of freedom, but at the same time opens the door to foundationlessness and relativism, even nihilism. So I see, these two grand themes of history, and I saw that they were being played out again in current departments with, these kind of people that practice the hermeneutics of suspicion, and then on the other hand, you have people that still, champion in some altered form the ideals of enlightenment. So I became very interested in those two themes to kind of counter this sense of suspicion and the way it was used in history. So I guess often the way history is practiced in this suspicious mode is to use history to delegitimate our current normative standpoints. The kind of masters of suspicion, Freud, Nietzsche, Marx, and more recently people like Foucault, what they would do is they would kind of say that, our moral views don't have justified reasons, they have kind of just causal explanations. And so I'm very much interested in countering that by showing that there are kind of progressive intellectual lineages and places where clear progress has been made in morality or, just kind of knowledge more generally. And so, it took a while for the penny to drop, for me to realize that this is what I was doing. But it was sometime around a decade ago, I was reading for the first time one of Bostrom's papers. I think it's the original Existential Risk and the Future of Humanity paper. And it just struck me that this was, a clear place where there had been progress or development when it comes to thinking about, the human in the world in the broadest possible sense. And yeah, it also struck me that there are histories of everything. There's histories of debt, there's histories of, there's even histories of, feces, there's histories of everything, right? But there wasn't a history that I could quickly find of extinction, human extinction, in this scientific, sober-minded sense that was being communicated in the work of Bostrom and others, Martin Rees, Richard Posner. I thought there's a lack here. So, you can go and find, there'll be hundreds and hundreds of books on the history of apocalypse or the history of Judgment Day, but I couldn't find one on the history of human extinction. So I guess, that's a long way of answering that question of how I came to doing what I've done.
Yeah, and as you said, so this book tells this sweeping story of how people have thought about existential risk specifically as differentiated from something like religious apocalypse. So maybe a natural first question then is just to ask, what is the modern understanding of existential risk, and why is it importantly unlike the kind of things that various religions have been talking about for a long time, which is the idea of an apocalypse?
Yeah. So I'll go for the the orthodox definition is an event that would cause the extinction or permanent curtailment of the potential for Earth originating intelligence. Yeah, and what's interesting, I think what's interesting there is that foregrounds the stakes, the moral stakes of that event, rather than the kind of causal etiology. So I think that's something to keep in mind when, exploring the distinction between apocalypse and extinction. But I think there are 4 major points of distinction. So the first one would be that, in apocalypse, so, when I say apocalypse, I would be referring to the end of the world in religious tradition, and also mythical worldviews, and also folklore. So the first point of differentiation would be that apocalypse rarely seems to think of the end of the world as the termination of humanly recognizable value or meaning. So think about the Christian Judgment Day. What happens there is it's basically the culmination of meaning and also the revelation of the final meaning of cosmic history, and also the revelation of ultimate value in a sense. So even if that's inscrutable to us as mere mortals now, it's still humanly recognizable. So it's kind of the word apocalypse itself means revelation, so it's inherently meaningful in a way that extinction isn't. So second one would be quite basic to us now, but historically not so much, is the idea that the world in its vastness, the physical cosmos, stripped of, kind of human meaning, human relations, would go on continuing to exist after this. So you don't find this in, kind of apocalypses in various cultures. There's, we can think of, say, for example, the kind of Mayan apocalypse, where it's interesting there because, in a sense, there's a destruction of value in there where humanity actually just disappear and that's it. There's no return or recompense. But it's also the end of the rest of the universe. So, the end of the universe, the end of humanity are coterminous. And so third one is that apocalypse doesn't seem to be sensitive to the idea that the end of meaning can happen for entirely meaningless reasons. So there's always this kind of pomp and circumstance to it, a sense of narrative justice. And then the fourth one is that also a lot of elder cosmologies are cyclical. So, for example, the Buddhist kind of apocalypse is just nested within this eternal cycle of return and ends. So basically, if you put all those together, and you can get, not all of those come together as a bundle always. You can get places where you get a couple, but you don't get all four of them. So, yeah, I mean, the kind of tagline that I like to say is that apocalypse secures a sense of an ending, whereas extinction is the ending of sense. Basically, what that means is that one is conciliatory and the other is inconsolable. So, yeah, I think one is to do with projecting justice onto the external universe. So, regardless of our actions and our decisions, justice will kind of always end up happening. Whereas the other one, it rests in this fundamental acknowledgement that our actions and decisions really matter for justice, and should we fail in this kind of ultimate sense, then that could potentially be the ending of everything we find meaningful.
So I wanted to quickly pick up on this discussion just of X risks, and in particular this association with value, because as you said, one of these maybe really scary things, and maybe something that people kind of didn't want to come to a conclusion to, is that this extinction of humanity isn't necessarily meaningful, or doesn't have this meaning or this great narrative to it. But as you say throughout your book as well, that isn't to say that this should just be something that we accept, that there actually is value in keeping humanity alive beyond just selfish reasons per se. Can you elaborate a bit about this?
Yeah. So, I mean, to kind of link back into these grand themes, existential risk and a sense of hope for, a large future are kind of historically and conceptually two sides of the same coin. So as soon as people understand that they are in some sense wholly responsible for human values, which was a historical discovery, that responsibility becomes a double-edged sword. So should we not safeguard them against the risks against them, then there is the potential for them to be radically diminished or destroyed entirely. But at the same time, that also means that we have the potential to do better and make the world a far better place, and our lot in it far better. So, yeah, I mean, the kind of background behind that, I think, we'll probably kind of eke out a bit more later. But, I think that they are historically and philosophically, completely intertwined.
Well, let's delve into these narratives then, and probably a good place to start is, let's say, with the default was before all of these discoveries were made. So you talk about this principle of plenitude that you kind of had in these pre-modern times about how we thought about destruction and extinction and the like. Can you talk a bit about what that idea is?
Yeah. So the principle of plenitude, so most basically, it states that all possibilities are realized. Again, this is kind of seems to be one of our default ways of thinking about possibility. On the surface, there's something very commonsensical about it, measuring possibilities based on their realization. It's tended to be that most people take that to mean that all things equal, nature is as full of possible realizations as it can be. So all possibilities are realized. So what this is there's an equilibrium between what is possible and what is realized. And this then quickly becomes a comment not just about the fullness of nature, but also its lack of empty gaps. So, some of this might strike us as kind of abstruse and strange, from our point living in the 21st century. But, I can't stress enough how much this was just a fundamental, incredibly strong intuition for people for centuries. So, I think this comes from a projection of our values onto nature. So without the requisite kind of critical work to disentangle these things, we tend to mingle them. So, for example, a rational value is that waste is bad. That's kind of an intuition that we all have. So projecting that onto nature, leads to this conviction of plenitude because... Well, waste is irrational, so if there's ever a place where nature could do something, could realize a species or an object or even an event, but it simply just never does, and by simply I mean that there is no reason for that. It's not to do with an incompatibility or a contradiction, it just never does, for no reason. That's just the way things are. That seems quite irrational and strange to us. So we think, well, no, obviously not. There couldn't be this waste, this empty gap where something could be but never is. So what that means is that not just that everything comes into existence that can do, that's also incompatible with the idea that things disappear from existence permanently. So the idea for centuries was that if a species is destroyed in our vicinity and we can see it, so for example, the Romans did record animals disappearing, but the background assumption was that they would exist elsewhere or reappear somewhere else in time. And people were explicit about this as well. And the same applied to the human species as well. So it kind of it precludes the irreversibility that gives the modern notion of species extinctions its meaning and its stakes. Because you can say that ultimately this thing will reappear elsewhere and elsewhen. So, yeah, I mean, I guess the basic intuition, I think, can be encapsulated with the fact that not only would it be a waste for nature to go through all the effort of producing a species and then destroy it, after it's destroyed, it's also, therefore, forever afterwards, a wasted opportunity. I do think that sometimes it does seem very strange to people to hear about this plenitude intuition now, but because I've spent so long kind of mining around in the historical depths, I can't stress enough how just unreflectively obvious it seemed to most people for a long time.
You're absolutely right, though. Like, at least in my own case, it's really weird, and it's really hard to get your head around how this kind of principle of plenitude could be like so pervasive and apparently so like obvious to so many people. And it makes me think you mentioned something else in the book, which is maybe related to this kind of principle, which is that there's this kind of hallmark of classical thought, and maybe even up until the Enlightenment, which was something like the thought that everything kind of worth discovering or everything important had already been discovered. Like we've done everything. What do you think that was?
Yeah, so I mean, that is actually a strict entailment of the principle of plenitude in one of its stronger forms. So you don't have to be an eternalist to believe in plenitude, but it certainly helps. Aristotle was an eternalist, so he thought, there was kind of no beginning and no end to time. So instantly, that seems to lend itself to believing in a strong form of plenitude. But yeah, like I say, a lot of Christian theologians also very, very much believed in plenitude, and they weren't eternalists. So, you don't need that. But so Aristotle says explicitly on a bunch of occasions that everything useful that can be discovered has previously been discovered. And if we don't know it now, it's just because it's been lost. But, this has happened infinitely many times before, so it can get technical quite quickly. But with plenitude, what it does is it collapses possibility into its realizations. But basically that means that it's very hard to think about a workable distinction between prescriptions and descriptions. So for every kind of value we can think of, we must be able to point to a time X where it happened or will happen. So it kind of, mingles is and ought in an interesting way. So, that is to say, plenitude doesn't just apply to species, it also applies to values and also epistemic discoveries. So for Aristotle, he said, everything useful has previously been discovered, and, also all kind of truths as well. So, yeah, the interesting thing about this is that it leads to, what I call kind of the indestructibility of value. So the thing is that there are places where these ancient and medieval authors talk about these massive calamities, these big disasters. Plato talks about these huge planetary catastrophes, conflagrations, but it's always nested within this conviction that things will return, and any loss of kind of value or, however you want to put it, any loss now will later be replenished. So you can have these local destructions of good things, but these are kind of just transformations. They're not actual losses. So value is conserved through all these things. one of the really interesting things about it is that it means that inquiry is just rediscovery or remembering the past in the right way. And also ethical action is just kind of returning to like previous maxima of like goodness. So you can see why, in a sense, it precludes the idea that the future is kind of a meaningful target for ethical action, in a sense. And yeah, you know, one thing that I want to stress and make clear, if I can, is how these really basic intuitions that, you know, our entire worldview rests on today, that a lot of us take for granted, took just centuries of hard work and detours and errors to get there. So we take it's so part of our worldview now that, you know, you can affect the amount of value in the world, but this just wasn't a thing that people used to be preoccupied with.
Yeah, and that's something else that stood out as being like particularly weird to me, was this idea that the distinction between, I think you put it as like between ethics and physics, what is and what ought to be, which just seems totally obvious to me, is kind of relatively novel. And there was a point where that wasn't so obvious, or that distinction was like blurred in various ways. Yes, I really like that. But as we kind of move forward in this story, skipping a few centuries, we get to this point where people are beginning to develop new technologies and also new scientific disciplines, most importantly, I think, heading into the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. So I think it'd be useful just to go through a few of them and just speak to how they influenced thinking about existential risk. So let's start with astronomy. We get this famous discovery that the Earth, it turns out, is not the center of the universe, and in fact, it revolves around something. Was that relevant to how people saw the kind of fate of the Earth and the place of the Earth in the universe more broadly?
In terms of revolutions in worldview, the Copernican revolution is, the go-to example. It's in a sense affected the meaning of the word revolution itself. But it's also where we get the idea of a philosophical revolution from as well. One of the things, though, is, and this has kind of become a myth of intellectual history, going back to the late Victorian period, is that the Copernican revolution was this huge blow to human self-esteem. So Freud liked to refer to the three main blows to human self-esteem. The one that was discovered by Copernicus, second was Darwin, and then the third, very modestly, was Freud himself. But so, it worked for him to kind of have this very dramatic sense of the progress of ideas. But yeah, instantly the Copernican revolution was absolutely not this knock to human self-esteem. So it was decentering because, it kind of implied this principle of mediocrity. But people didn't interpret that very carefully to begin with. Because of a form of plenitude, again, actually, the space of realizations was massively expanded by the kind of thesis of the plurality of worlds. So, the Copernican revolution is wrapped up in this idea of the plurality of worlds. So basically belief in exoplanets. And so, it was decentering. The space of realizations is massively expanded, but the space of possibility was not. So people believed basically that every single world would have the same kind of history and the same realities as Earth. So, Copernicus wasn't a blow to, the Copernican revolution was not a blow to human self-esteem in the sense that decentering us actually was a kind of spreading of anthropic life throughout the entire universe. So it's one of these interesting episodes because it shows the persistence of certain biases into the secularizing and naturalizing worldviews. There's always these kind of delays and these lags, and the scientific revolution didn't instantly just kind of remove all the baggage of the scholastic theological worldview where we just presumed everything was teleological and designed, because in some sense these age-old biases and basically our tendencies to contaminate our objective theories with these kind of value-laden presumptions, they continued well into the secular, naturalized worldview of the scientific revolution.
So, as you say, these blows to self-esteem need to kind of come from other places as well. And one of those places seems to be this field of astrobiology, which actually, before I read your book, I didn't really know was a thing. But it sounds super interesting. And in particular, this debate between these kinds of two schools of thought, catastrophism and uniformitarianism. Can you talk a bit about what that debate is and how that then linked into our understanding of X risks?
Yeah. So astrobiology, the way I use it is kind of anachronistic. So I'm kind of pushing back a field that's only a few decades old. But what I'm doing is I'm trying to uncover its, long-term conditions of possibility. So given all these things I've been talking about, these kind of biases, contaminations, the central idea of astrobiology is habitability. So the question of where life can emerge, elsewhere in the cosmos. What are the conditions for that? So it's applying insights from macroevolution, biochemistry, and thinking about them in a cosmological context. So the very ability to think about habitability is thinking about the questions of possibility of life as if they're not just universal anyway. So these were questions that didn't occur to people just a few centuries ago. So I wanted to show how, what is quickly becoming one of the, I think, most interesting, fast-moving fields of science, how, its conditions of possibility stretch back further into history and were, again, very hard won. But to talk about catastrophism and uniformitarianism, so that is now important to fields like, cosmology and astrobiology, but it comes originally from geology. So geology as a science consolidated during the Enlightenment. So, people have told themselves stories about the creation of the world, for a long time, but they haven't, kind of thought about it in a scientific framework. So it emerged during the 1700s as a mature discipline. But the fundamental methodological question was basically how to apply the scientific method to things that we can't observe. So how can you be an empiricist about things that are so far in the past that no human can ever observe them? And originally the field was wrapped up in these quite theistic questions. So it was like, how can we explain the deluge in the Bible? Let's go and find evidence for it. And so you'd conscript these supernatural explanations for these kind of abrupt interventions of God into the world. And those would be the explanatory story that we tell ourselves. But then as the field matured, scientists were like, well, we need to be empiricists and rigorous about this. So let's cut all of the unobservable supernatural stuff away and just focus purely on what we can observe. And that led to this idea, against catastrophes, that was called uniformitarianism. So it's the idea that nature is very uniform, which is to say that it will be the same in the past and the future as it is in the present. So this is a kind of overinflated form of empiricism. It's like taking empiricism far too far. It was obviously necessary at the time to get rid of the supernatural, residue. But led to this sense that nature is always the same, which interestingly enough, to, get back onto the history of existential risk and, extinction threat, meant that the idea of a species extinction was a problem. So around this time, there was undeniable evidence, paleontological evidence of previous prehistoric extinctions. But for a uniformitarian who, their kind of major motivating value is to look for places where nature is uniform, that's a real problem because, here's something which used to be but isn't anymore. How do you kind of square that with your idea that the past and the present and the future are all continuous? So basically they went, to the oldest trick in the book, which is a form of plenitude, and said, the Earth is this steady state system, possibilities emerge in it, disappear, but then they'll come back at some point in the future. So you actually got these Victorian geologists saying that at some point in the future the dinosaurs would return, and they had these visions of the Sussex countryside being stomped over by iguanodon all over again. By kind of strict implication, that means the same would apply to us. So, you get another instance where these background assumptions are kind of preventing and obstructing us from thinking about the permanence or the stakes of human extinction.
So something else you mentioned was this idea that there was just this assumption that all matter was organic and that the word inorganic was like relatively new. Where did that come from?
So I find this very, very interesting. It's a sense in which that distinction didn't exist. So there wasn't a distinction between the inorganic or the organic. So people, it's not that people thought that the world was literally made out of flesh or meat, but it was incredibly teleological. So they thought of the world almost exclusively with organic metaphors. So there's one good example is this polymath Athanasius Kircher, who was writing in the 1600s, and he had this book Mundus Subterraneus, which is one of the first books to have a cross-section of the Earth in it. So, the idea that the Earth had this internal structure was also a kind of novel thing, because, again, it's quite commonsensical to just not think about that, because none of us have ever kind of, gone much further than the deepest mind. So he used all these organic metaphors for the Earth. So he thought that the Earth basically worked like an organism, volcanoes are a form of flatulence, all of these kind of things. And it was very common at the time to think that, in a sense, all matter is occupied or wound up in the economies of use for life, which, again, is a kind of commonsensical thing to think. If you strip away all of the, knowledge that you know now and you had to start from the beginning, that would be a kind of state that you'd probably plateau on for a long time. Another interesting example is Edmund Halley, who is otherwise, brilliant, innovative, polymath scientist. He came up with this theory that the Earth was hollow and filled with concentric rings. And one of the supporting arguments that he rallied for that was because all of these inner rings must be populated, so the whole world is populated, and that makes a lot more sense, because otherwise it would be this massive waste of space on the end. If the whole Earth is just this big solid inorganic thing, that's a waste of space. It's not necessarily that people were thinking that the world was fleshy and alive in a kind of literal sense, but they thought that the whole thing was in some sense end oriented towards life and the maintenance of the living. Some people literally did actually say that organic matter came before anything inorganic. So Erasmus Darwin, Charles's grandfather, explicitly said that all the rocky mass of the Earth was germinated from these kind of ancient microorganisms. So people kind of had their whole vision of the cosmos the wrong way around. It took so much longer than might seem obvious for people to really realize that the vast majority of matter in the kind of our observable vicinity is absolutely sterile, dead, and doesn't seem to be doing much interesting.
So you call this period of thinking, I think, cosmic nonchalance. I don't know if I pronounced that right, but this kind of idea that even though we have some evidence of some species going extinct, and that might be possible of humanity as well, on the whole, we don't really care, because clearly there's so much life in this universe that will reappear again, and life will kind of find a way. But then you get some more findings and there's more evidence of mass extinction, that some people start taking this more seriously and start predicting as well when we might ourselves go extinct, or when humanity might disappear. And this kind of aligns up as well with these discoveries in probability and forecasting. And one of these people I want you to talk a bit more about is Joseph Lalande, and what he found and what he kind of predicted.
So he was a French mathematician, and he is the first person that I've managed to find who applies very, very crude, let me stress, very crude probability to the question of a planetary disaster. So yeah, comets had become a occupation for scientists, for kind of 1600s, and then Lalande was writing in the late decades of the 1700s. And during that span of time, probability theory had really flourished and had become a legitimate and incredibly fast-moving field. So this was the time of Laplace and these giants of probability. And so Lalande, who was in the same kind of milieu as Laplace, he wrote this short pamphlet on comets and applied very basic probability. So what he did was he worked out how much of the Earth's entire orbit the Earth itself is occupying at any one time. So he calculated that based on arc seconds as it was 1 in 73 millionth, I think. So at any point in time, the Earth is occupying 1 in 73 millionth of the entire orbit. And then said, well, if a comet does intersect with our orbit at any place, at kind of unspecified time, there's obviously a 1 in 73 million chance of it colliding with us, which again is very crude. But just even kind of applying those questions to that kind of methodology to these kind of questions that previously and even at the time were primarily approached with basically moral intuition rather than the kind of impersonal rigor of maths. It was in a sense innovative. The interesting thing is that most people at the time just had no idea what probability was and thought that he was therefore saying, that this was some kind of solid forecast. And apparently his pamphlet caused panic on the streets of Paris. So I mean, it's an interesting episode, and it points to this, wider shift where, like I said, these questions of calamity and catastrophe were previously approached with our kind of, emotional resources, our kind of religious frameworks, our, strong, value-laden intuitions. And here they were being outsourced to the kind of, the formal systems of, maths, which kind of, gets rid of a lot of that baggage. And that's what I think is important here, is this kind of impersonality of these mathematical forecasts. Really kind of, I channeled our intuitions in a useful way here. So I mean, Lalande is an interesting one. And then he after that, a whole bunch of, you'd get people every decade or so kind of updating and bringing their own probabilities to the table on that.
One of the very small but poetic details that really stood out to me was you mentioned that he published this pamphlet, I think, just 3 years after a comet passed by Earth, which was around 2 million kilometers away, which might sound like a lot, but it actually ends up being the closest a comet has passed the Earth in recorded history, at least. And that seems like such a freakish coincidence, right? I mean, clearly must be, but you couldn't write it better, right? You couldn't write history better than that.
Yeah. I was shocked when I found that as well. I think it's contested, but on one account that is the closest recorded encounter. So very poetic. Everyone was panicking about Lalande's comet, but 3 years earlier we'd had a close shave.
And speaking of comets as well, you brought up Halley, right? And he actually made a successful prediction of this reappearance of, the Coma, which has since been named after him, which shows that this isn't just a bunch of eccentric scientists kind of, pulling numbers out of nowhere. This is really a kind of progress, right? Yeah,
definitely. So, the comet, I think, becomes, at least in my mind, becomes a symbol of a lot of the innovations and breakthroughs in this period, because as well as attracting these kind of probabilistic, analyses, because in a sense, there are a bunch of billiard balls flying around our kind of cosmic vicinity. Also, the fact that their paths are kind of tractable by another field of mathematics that was emerging at this time, calculus. The massive innovation of calculus, and again, it's hard to overstate how huge this is in the foundations of modern science. Is that it makes continuous processes tractable to computing. So, these kind of curved pathways of, all kinds of different natural processes, from, population to, the pathways of comets, they all kind of yield themselves to prediction. And what this does is, because of the impersonality and the rigor and the precision of numbers, it means that people could begin to talk about, vast timescales in quite a detailed way. And what this did was replaced the shallowness of infinity or eternity with actually some kind of structure of these long-term processes that kind of unwind beyond the human temporal horizon, but are still kind of tractable to calculation in a way. So what I mean by the shallowness of eternity is, to go back to Aristotle, is, eternity is, everything happens in it, but also nothing new. So there's kind of, there's not much structure to this eternity. So, to kind of go back to the birth of geoscience, which was happening at the same time, this is where you get deep time. It's not eternal time. It's not infinite time. It's deep time. So it's these kind of massive but finite expanses. And so all of these really revolutionary developments were all happening around the same time, and all converge in a very different worldview by the end of the Enlightenment.
I'm glad you brought up the idea of deep time. Could you say a bit about this idea of big history that was kind of growing up around the same period? And can you mention in particular this name James Jeans that came up, and he had this fantastic example of a postage stamp which really stood out to me?
Yeah. So that I was so happy when I found that, because it's such a good, it's a good example of a really brilliant science writer doing their job perfectly. So Jeans was a prominent physicist in the very early decades of the 1900s, and he wrote a few very popular and well-read books on physics. But one of the interesting things about him was he was also one of those kind of synoptic scientists who'd do the science and then also think about how, we can fit our, kind of manifest image, our human worldview into this. So, it was, around this time that people were kind of really hammering down, forecasts for the future of Earth's habitability given the life cycle of our sun. And Jeans calculated, this vast expanse of future time that we have on this planet, and used this brilliant metaphor of it's something like, the thickness of the postage stamp is human history, and then Cleopatra's obelisk, the length of that, which is, it's quite big. You balance that on top of the postage stamp, and that's the potential future history for humanity on Earth, on Earth alone. And so, this is it's really interesting because Arnold Toynbee, one of the prominent historians at the time, he read this and thought it was very interesting. And in his treatment of this, he actually brings it back to this stuff with Aristotelian eternalism that we've been talking about, and also the Platonic idea of cycling civilizations. Toynbee said that this discovery of modern physics completely reverses that worldview where everything that can be done has been done in the past, because we now realize that history itself is tiny. It would be very surprising for our kind of archaeologists to now discover some, ancient prehistorical civilization with vast amounts of knowledge, far surpassing what we have now. No, everything to be done lies ahead. And this is a fundamental shift in our relationship to time, and also our kind of placement in history and our potential. I really love this Jeans quote, because I think it, obviously a lot of that optimism about the long-term future then gets kind of derailed throughout the atrocities of the 20th century. But I think that obviously with, kind of transhumanism, effective altruism, the kind of modern movements that are emerging, this idea of, in part of its history, this idea of the vastness of the future and the vastness of the potential in it is re-emerging. So it was really nice to find, someone talking about it in quite rigorous terms, at least a century ago.
Yeah, fantastic. And let's come back to that. But something I want to mention is I like this idea of there being a kind of shift away to more impersonal ways of thinking about physics in the example you gave, predicting orbits of comets and so on. And that sounds right to me. So, Aristotle's physics, for instance, you might describe it, roughly speaking, as a world full of things wanting to do things, right? Nature abhors a vacuum and gravity happens because things want to move towards the center of the earth. And you also mentioned that, it's not just physics. This kind of shift towards numerical and precise and impersonal approaches was also applied to kind of ourselves and to what gets called population science or demography. Could you say something about why that is significant, particularly with respect to thinking about existential risk and the future of humanity?
Yeah. So, the thing that shocked me very early on when I was, kind of embarking on what became this project was one of the very first instances of someone talking about the extinction in humanity in what I believe to be a naturalistic sense, one that fulfilled most of my criteria for something that isn't an apocalypse and isn't extinction, comes from Baron de Montesquieu, who in 1721 wrote this book, The Persian Letters, and he talks about humanity going extinct through depopulation. So he subscribed to this theory that was quite popular at the time, that the population of Europe and potentially the world had declined radically since Roman times. Ironically enough, given that the 1700s was the beginning of the massive uptick in population, so it was kind of funny to see people talking about this when the world population was about to explode. But completely right that it's this kind of impersonal approach. Is he was taking these very basic ideas of extrapolation and calculation, thinking if humanity is this arithmetical mass, this aggregate mass, and there is a trend in one direction or the other, here down, there will be a point where it dwindles to zero, which again, it seems so obvious to us now, but this was a new way of, putting those concepts into action. So, and the other major thing about demography and why it was important was that it inculcated thinking about humanity as a species, or, at that level of a global mass, so a global collective. So as soon as that came into view, obviously now a new unit of perishing came into view as well. So it wasn't just, the death of civilizations or peoples or, individuals. It was also potentially the death of the aggregate mass. So so that was very important to that. And you get the first kind of fictions on what we now recognize as human extinction. The genre was called The Last Man. And you need that arithmetic idea to think about that, because another distinction between apocalypses and extinctions is apocalypses are almost always univocal, in the sense that everyone dies at the same time, or there's kind of some universal calamity. So it was this this kind of quite granular approach that emerges from applying arithmetic to populations, that allowed us to kind of think about the last person. What's interesting as well is that all of this demographic thinking also emerges from advances in probability. So Halley himself, it was people trying to compute annuities, and so they were trying to kind of figure out mortality rates. Another guy called Grant, he was he did some innovations in this area, where you notice that there are these kind of regularities in population, and it basically just made people start to think about humanity at that very abstract and impersonal level.
So we've talked about all sorts of different fields here, which are hitting into humanity's self-esteem. One of the things that I want to bring in is Darwin's work. In particular, what I found really interesting about how your book talks about Darwin's work is actually how it got reinterpreted. So initially, people found a lot of hope in Darwin, and you mentioned this thing called the intelligence niche. Could you briefly explain what that is and why people saw that as a source of hope when it comes to humanity's survival?
Yeah. So again, it's another example of our tendency to allow our values, or basically what we would like the world to look like, to contaminate our objective theories. Prior to Darwin, for actually a surprisingly long amount of time, people held to an idea of transmutation of species. So, the idea that species change into other species and, there's this mutation over time, it actually predates Darwin. But those prior theories were very teleological and very progressivist. So the idea often was that humanity is the pinnacle that includes all the previous animals within itself. So this was popular in German natural science at the beginning of the 1800s. And so, people would look to embryonic development and see that, think that they saw that in the development of the human embryo, it repeats the fish, the mammal, goes through all the previous stages. So people had this very strong intuition, again, that, things seem to be leading up to man. And so, Darwin's dangerous idea, right, was that, we don't need a designer to have design. But it took a long time. Again, there's this lag, like with the Copernican revolution. All these kind of auxiliary supporting observations and theories need to be kind of dragged up behind this idea for its full implications to become very clear. So with Darwinism, it did take a while for that kind of anti-teleological lesson to become as apparent as needed to be, to fully decenter humanity from that evolutionary narrative. And you can still see this today as, a lot of folk intuitions about evolution, do play into this progressivist idea that things, kind of lead up to man. So Darwin himself did often make progressivist sounding claims. Another interesting thing was that one of his most important, precursors was Charles Lyell, who was, the kind of master of uniformitarian geology. And so to go back to what I was saying earlier about, this uniformitarian geology precludes kind of disequilibrial things. So there's this massive equilibrium across Earth history. Darwin applied that same intuition to biological history. So what that meant was that he subscribed to a very strong form of gradualism, and also continuity across species. So Darwin actually said that mass extinctions, even though the evidence for them was beginning to be noticed, quite early on, people noticed that biodiversity dips in these, quite severe places. Darwin said that this is an artifact of our limited perspective on the fossil record. There are these continuous lineages, successful animals don't die out, they change into other animals. There aren't these kind of extrinsic contingent events, say an asteroid. Even the most adapted species could suddenly just be wiped out. This was quite an alien thing to the Victorian mind, to the post-Darwinian, the interpretation of Darwin in the Victorian era. And it's also it's surprisingly quite recent that we've begun to entertain again kind of catastrophist, ideas since the 50s, but gaining a lot more momentum with the discovery of the Chicxulub crater in New Mexico, which provides evidence for the impactor event that killed the dinosaurs. But yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, Darwin originally seemed to make people feel very hopeful about the future of humanity, because even if those things don't look like humans, they're obviously going to be descended from us in some meaningful way, because very successful animals turn into other ones, become more adapted. They don't just simply die out for contingent extrinsic reasons. Yeah,
and exactly as we kind of abstract a bit from humanity away, there's also this this problem that it might not be the case that natural selection will ensure that an intelligent species will replace us. I think you mentioned it as this planet of the ape hypothesis in the book, that if humanity were to disappear, the octopuses won't necessarily take over and evolve into something that kind of resembles civilization. And that is a real problem if we kind of think that there is something special about humanity and this ability to preserve culture and all the creative value around it as well.
Yeah. So the Planet of the Apes hypothesis is Charles Lineweaver, this really great planetary scientist. He wrote this paper on basically evolutionary convergence and how confident we can be about a returning kind of human level intelligence should we disappear. And so he called this again this kind of intuition, latent intuition that floats around popular culture, that if we mess it up, then the monkeys will take over, or at a stretch maybe the dolphins or the octopus. So these early debates in evolution about progressivism, this is like also orthogeneticism was a similar idea, that there's directionality in evolution, and the kind of how much telos there is. Also, is adaptation always related to increasing complexity? These debates have kind of modulated into a debate around convergence and contingency. So at the beginning of the 1900s, you get biologists beginning to say, publish these kind of incendiary papers saying, all of you people who think that aliens will look like us are, you're not reading your Darwin close enough, you're not, engaging with evolution close enough. And then as soon as SETI gets off the ground, beginning of the 1960s, you get a bunch of very prominent evolutionary biologists getting quite angry with SETI and thinking that it isn't paying much attention to this idea of evolutionary contingents. And then more recently, the debate, two of the main figures are Stephen Jay Gould, an evolutionary biologist, also a brilliant historian of ideas, and Simon Conway Morris, another evolutionary biologist. So Gould is very much a contingent, he believes in evolution contingency. So he says if we replayed the tape of life, the results would be vastly different. There's no guarantee that a kind of intelligent, value-led, ethically conscious, featherless biped would emerge. We have no guarantee for that. Whereas on the other side, Conway Morris says that, there's a lot of evidence for convergence. So, the eye has evolved so many times.
Carcinization.
Exactly. Yeah. So if we replayed the tape, there's probably more evidence that there'll be crabs everywhere rather than featherless bipeds. But yeah, so there's the debate is ongoing, and it forms one of the kind of core disagreements, or animating tensions in astrobiology. But the Planet of the Apes hypothesis, I think. So obviously the facts are still, there's still open questions everywhere here. There's no conclusions. But what I would say from the history is, across history, we've kind of constantly had to realize how careful we have to be in the vicinity of these kind of things. And again, how we are tendent to have this tendency to contaminate with our values. So the kind of the direction of travel, the general drift of history is, kind of further away from the idea of anthropoids everywhere. And more recently, there is a lot of evidence, or a lot of good arguments coming out around observer selection effects and those kind of areas, basically giving good reasons for why some of the very good reasons for expecting life to be common and complex and intelligent life to be common might be less persuasive than they first seem. This is like an ongoing, this isn't just history, it's history in the making still. But it's one of the most interesting questions, I think.